Hi, and welcome to Apes and Pants with me, Sean Coffey and Chris Brennan. Thanks for joining us as we explore the whys and wherefores of human behavior. For more information on this episode and to learn more about what we do, visit us at adultacademy.org/apes and pants. Chris, what are we doing today?
Sean, we're going to focus on one question. If we live in a time of abundance, why the hell are we so neurotic? Stick with us.
It is now time for Apes in Pants.
So it seems ditching teenage fantasy means ditching all your dreams. All your friends and peers and family solemnly tell you you will have to grow up, be an adult, yeah, be bored and unfulfilled. Oh, but no one's yet explained to me exactly what's so great about saving 50 years away on something that you hate. About meekly shuffling down the path of mediocrity. But if that's your road, then take it, but it's not the road for me.
Apes and
Won't
Pants.
sit down and won't shut up. And most of all, I will not grow up.
We both see ourselves as neurotics. It's something we've talked about several times, and I can think of way back to one of our first hikes, topic came up. When you say you're neurotic, what do you mean?
Well, principally, I think it's an anxiety thing, right? It's sort of this neurotic obsession with my being, my existence, my value as a person. And it's sort of this pervasive existential dread. For me, it's my anxiety and my depression manifesting itself in this sort of constant undercurrent question of, am I good enough? Am I doing enough? And basically, am I worthy of any sort of respect or attention or anything else as a person? That's how I sort of see myself, but I also like this explanation from Greg Enriquez, who's a psychologist who writes for Psychology Today. And he says this, quote, "Although the term neurotic has more recently fallen out of favor, it was used by psychiatrists for most of the 20th century to define a broad category of conditions that were associated with poor functioning, anxiety, and depression. But were clearly differentiated from psychotic in that, in contrast to individuals in the latter category, neurotics maintained contact with reality and were rarely engaged in highly deviant, socially unacceptable behavior." I like that.
Can we define highly deviant?
Yes, anything that is directly harmful to other people is really the nitty-gritty of that one. So if you look at the definitions of like psychosis or psychopathy, which is a distinct category psychologically from a psychotic is somebody who is not in touch with reality. They do not have a good sense of what is real and what is not. So for the psychotic, delusions are a thing. The schizophrenic behavior is most properly a psychosis. Psychopathy is somebody who has no empathy. It's a degree of only seeing other people as instruments, not as having value in and of themselves. But for the neurotic, so the neurotic has all of the anxiety and the depression and sort of the undercurrent of stress that people who are dealing with many different types of psychoses might, but they have a firm grip on reality. They have a better, clearer distinction that, they're not the object of external forces that are imposing things on them. They recognize, at least I recognize, that the things that make me neurotic often have no basis in reality. They are things that I know are unrealistic. They live in my head. They turn their screws and turn their knives.
Kind of like a time frame on a self-imposed to-do list, or something where you're kind of you said it's almost like your own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So for me, one of my neurotic experiences is that every time my wife and son get in a car to drive someplace together, I have this huge anxiety response about what I will do if they get into a fatal car accident. Every time they go any place.
An OODA loop kind of thing.
Yeah,
where you play out the scenario in your head. How would I respond? What would I say? What would happen?
In a very negative feedback loop aspect of it. And when Shawn mentions the OODA loop, he's talking about this concept that I love, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on. And it's an analysis of human decision making, sort of postulated by a retired Air Force colonel, now passed away, by the name of John Boyd, and sometimes also referred to as the Boyd loop. And OODA stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's got all these feedback loops, and one of them is this feedback loop where your orientation, sort of the way you look at the world, the worldview you take, impacts the perceptions that you're having of the world. Well, if that aspect of the loop gets magnified without the inject of good, accurate information about the real world, then what happens is it becomes ever increasingly out of touch with the real world, and it starts feeding on itself. So, yeah.
Sorry, little quick segue into something else there, but so that neuroticism that you have, how does that? And this is going to come off the wrong way, and I'm trying to spit it out. How does it drive you every day? What does it change about you? How you see things? From, we talked about this last episode, nuking those 5 hours of work that we just knew was bad. How does it drive you? What does it change about you day to day, midterm, long term?
So let's take that incident with nuking 5 hours of work and having to reboot and come back at this. And to a certain extent, I mean, we recorded this episode already and nuked it because it didn't go well. Even after we did episode 1, which went well, the first time we tried to record episode 2.
Join us for episode 3, Neuroticism.
However many takes it takes.
Yeah.
Once
3,
again,
4.
for the second or third or fourth time. But so here's the distinction for me. Nuking the material because it was bad was not an act of neuroticism. That was an act of wanting to produce the highest quality product that we could, which is a very reasonable goal. It's a very purposeful, intentional thing that you do. The neurotic response was the one that I had in the 20 minutes after you left the house, where I wanted to go crawl into bed, pull the covers over my head, and say, screw it, we're done, we can't do this, we don't have the skills, we're stupid, why would we think that we could accomplish this? That was the neurotic response. The neurotic response was the one that wasn't in touch with reality. The one that was in touch with the reality of the moment and the recognition that, okay, we didn't do a good job. That's perfectly reasonable. We can do better. We want to do better. Perfectly reasonable. I'm a failure as a human being because you and I, who have never sat down and podcasted before, let alone attempted to do long-form video content in this way, the fact that we didn't get that perfectly right the first time we tried it, and that was somehow internalized as a reflection on my self-worth as a human being, that's the neuroticism coming out.
We both have good lives, spouses and kids who love us, good friends, safe homes, enough food to eat. Why is it that with living with plenty, we both have these kind of obsessions?
Well, I think part of it is that the only way for you to, the only reason, let me think about how to phrase this a little bit better. If you don't have some level of security of your basic needs, I don't know that you have the luxury of being neurotic because you have real pressures. Like if you don't have enough food to eat, if you're exposed to a chronic threat of physical violence, if you don't have reasonable shelter, things like this, if your basic physiological safety community needs are not met, then the anxiety and the stress that you're dealing with isn't neurotic. It's survival stress. So it's only, I think, once you start to have some level of stability, and in this case we might even say abundance, where those survival concerns are now off the table. I think it's probably only then that you find yourself able to have neurotic concerns.
How might you have? So you have to have some type of good fear.
Yes, absolutely.
Good fear versus neuroses. How does being neurotic get in the way of living life?
So let's start with good fear, right? So what's good fear? Good fear is fear that is in tune with an actual survival pressure, okay? So let's say I have a fear of snakes, okay? A fear of snakes is not a wholly unreasonable fear. One of the reasons that fear of snakes is so prevalent in humans is that humans co-evolved, or I should say primates co-evolved with big snakes in the environment. And they were a very real predatory threat. So we now, as a species, have this sort of archetypal image of snakes as something to be afraid of, which is why if you're walking down a trail in the woods and you catch a glimpse of a stick out of the corner of your eye, you are just as likely to jump back before you do anything else. And it's because your brain sees that shape, and the first thing that it thinks on a survival level, on a evolved survival level, is snake. It's only once the brain catches up, the cognitive processing catches up, where you can look at it and go, oh, stick, not a threat. So anytime that we are dealing with a fear response to a true survival threat, I think that's perfectly good fear. That's fear that keeps us alive. The fear that somebody has when they are confronted with physical violence, that initial desire to fight or to flee, that's a survival response. That's fear driving a survival response. That's positive. I'm afraid, I have anxiety about getting in the car and driving to the airport because of all the bad things that could happen. That starts to become a little bit more of a neurotic fear. Because the reality is, even as dangerous as driving is, it's not the immediate life threat that needs to paralyze us. The fear of getting on the airplane once you get to the airport, right? How many people do you know that are afraid to fly? It's the safest transportation mechanism there is. And yet we have a fear of it.
And yet I only know one person who's afraid to fly. And she needs about a 3 Xanax, 4 wine cocktail to get on the plane. So I suppose that's getting in the way of living life.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, neurosis, for me, neurosis very rarely gets in the way of me living my life by putting me into a sort of paralytic state. I've dealt with anxiety and depression my entire life, and it very rarely has put me in the condition that it has other people that I know who deal with these things, of literally having to crawl under the covers for 3 or 4 days and not being able to come out. That's a very real response for people who deal with anxiety and depression. And I don't know why I don't have that manifestation of it. And I certainly don't think that it has anything to do with being stronger or healthier or more functional or anything like that. I think it has more to do with having an internal monologue that attacks me even worse if I do that than if I just put my head down and go through life in an intensely stressful place. I think there's I think my neurosis actually is one of the things that forces me out of the house in that condition, which may or may not. There's probably no value judgment to it whatsoever. It's just how my experience of it manifests. But the way it gets in the way of my life is it stops me from doing things on a broader scale. You know, if I hit the only reason this is continuing is because it's on my calendar to come over and meet you and do it. If it wasn't on my calendar to come over and meet you to record a podcast or to shoot another video or to prep for a workshop, at that moment of 5 hours of work having to get flushed, if I was doing that by myself, this project would have been over historically. And a lot of projects have gone that way for me. Books that I've been writing, other, big projects that I've undertaken and started to be enthused about and started to get into. The reason that those stop is because that neurosis comes in, that fear of not being good enough, that self-doubt comes in, and that's how it has gotten in the way of my life and paralyzed me, is that it stops me from doing these things that I think would be really creative, really interesting, really positive in the overall. But then that little voice comes in and starts saying, "Who are you? What do you don't know what you're doing. Why would anybody want this?" So literally one of the only reasons that I continue to do this project is because I've got a commitment to you. It's the same reason people show up and work out together. It's the same reason you have a workout buddy, is to have the motivation to get up and do it when you don't want to.
Curious about the inner monologue, because as I'm listening to you, I keep thinking to myself, I always had this little defense mechanism, whatever you want to call it. If I ignore it, it'll go away. If I take my head, put it under the covers, it'll go away. It'll go away. It'll go away. And
I had that with paying bills for decades.
And I think when it came down to this project,
thankfully my wife handles the budget
now. When it came down to this, I remember just a couple weeks ago getting it off the ground. I was having this, I don't know if it was however you want to call it, good fear. Am I doing enough? And I kept saying to you, all right, I feel like I'm kind of behind here. I'm not doing enough. I don't have a drive. And you kind of calmed me down in a different way and said, when we get to this part of the project and we start doing these things, this is where you're going to excel. And I think I knew that inside of my head. I had that monologue to say, I know where I will be productive. I think I'm the kind, for whatever reason, I need some of that outside head to just say, here, this will be A, B, or C. Whether it be stop thinking you're no good at it, or slow down, think through it, it'll be fine. Some of that internal monologue for me also becomes definitely attached to self-worth. Like, is this something valuable? Are people looking for this? And, sending out emails this week to friends and family. I got a great email response from a friend, and I just, in the back of my mind, I always knew this guy would be into it. He would have something to say, and in the email he had 5 questions. So it's kind of interesting that what you're putting out there, you kind of have that rational thought of this. Some things are going to be right, some things are going to fail, and just you need that one little push to say it's all right, whether it's your own voice, somebody else's voice. But I think once you get that, you then get through those good fear, you use that good fear to kind of help you get through the neuroses of it.
Sure. I mean, so for me, so 2 things. One, I had a very similar experience when I first started telling friends about this project. I had a friend from Nebraska who I had sent some of the initial stuff to, and he had been really heavily involved in the Fire Service Warrior project that I ran for many years. And the phone call with him was incredibly uplifting, because what he said was, for the first time I hear you having your fire back in the last 3 years. And that was what I needed to hear at the time. I needed to hear, man, I am so glad to see and hear that you're doing this, and to hear you coming out of this, the passion, the intensity, the drive. I needed to hear that. And I think that for me at least, and I'm not going to speak for everybody who describes themselves as neurotic, but I think for me it comes down to this. All anybody who is dealing with being neurotic is looking for is the reassurance that they're loved. And it's just we're not able to sit down and look at ourselves in the mirror, Stuart Smalley like, and say, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. Our brains don't work that way. Mine certainly doesn't. And we crave that from others, that external validation, because because the inner monologue is constantly, am I good enough? Am I doing anything of value? Am I contributing anything to society? And at least for me, the follow-up to that is, man, I don't feel like I am. I really should just go to the garage and hang myself. And I don't say that as a joking thing. That's a very real part of the inner dialogue that I deal with and have dealt with my entire life. And that thought, that thought towards self-harm has been one of the biggest things that's put me into therapy. When that voice comes out, that's when I go, oh, it's time to go get help. And I think that that's part of being neurotic, is that it's just that looking for validation, because we don't find it from within all the time. And then when you're doing great, when things are strong and you're feeling good, and for me, in part, when I am taking care of my body and getting good sleep and getting good nutrition and doing my meditation and doing all these other things that establish healthy baseline conditions, then that doubtful voice is not as strong. When I'm priming my body to do better, then I do better. But at the end of the day, I'm always going to come back to that question of, am I good enough? And I'm looking for people to say yes. And I think that's all of us.
So what can we do to get past the neuroses? Because it's not the thing itself, right? It's not your hang up necessarily. But how do you get past it?
Well, talk about it, right? I mean, that's the entire principle of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and all of these other things, is that if we talk about the things that are stressful for us, that produce anxiety for us, by talking about them, we refuse to let them isolate us. And by refusing to be isolated, we increase our social connection. And as social primates, one of the ways we derive that feeling of self-worth is from the acceptance of our community. So if we refuse to talk about the things that are anxiety-producing, depression-producing, stress-producing, fear-producing, then we put ourselves in this place where we are intentionally isolating ourselves from our community. And as soon as we do that, we reduce the amount of acceptance we feel. So it's that whole idea that if you know the name of something, you have power over it, right? That's why people like, in many cases, having a good diagnosis of, I mean, whether you're talking about anxiety and depression or cancer, if we know what it is, we can treat it to some degree, even the things that we can't heal. As soon as we have narrowed it down to something that has a set of characteristics and we can put a name to it, We can start to do something about it. And in the same vein, I think that any sort of thing that produces anxiety and fear in us, if we can name our fears, then we can do something about them. If we can name our anxieties, then we can do something about them.
So then it is. It's just talking. So it's just talking about them.
Well, I don't think it's just talking about them. Talking about them is a starting point.
Right. So then, what are the next steps that come out of this? How do you start to get through? How do you start to get through them? And once you label them, then what strategies or what things would you have? Basis, starting point. Just to, if step 1 is naming it, what's step 2?
Well, I will revisit the point that I am not a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, or medical doctor in any way, nor do I play one on television or on the internet. So all of this is simply spoken of from my own perspective as somebody who has been living with these things and approaching these things. But with that caveat in mind, I think that the next step after talking about it is, well, I think there's 2 things that have to come sort of in lockstep with one another. And maybe they're different steps and maybe they're just facets of one general step. I'm not sure. But I'd say it's this. The first is establishing expectations and outcomes. Where do I want to go? Where do I want to get to? And doing that in a way that we can do something with. I love, when it comes to goals and objectives, the acronym SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time sensitive, because it forces us to get past the wish phase of saying things. You know, I want to feel good every day. That's a wish. That means nothing, because what does feeling good mean? Does feeling good mean I'm not depressed, or does feeling good mean that I can back squat 700 pounds? You didn't tell me, so I don't know. And if you're not able to tell me, then you probably don't know yourself what it means for you. So part of it, I think, is establishing those outcomes and expectations. And the other thing is this whole idea of calibrating our expectations. And we talked a little bit about fear calibration in episode 1, and we've talked about fear calibration in some of the other work that we've done. But I think the other aspect of it is this recognition of the difference between expecting and accepting a degree of difficulty in life, because life is hard. You know, as the saying goes, life's hard. It's harder if you're stupid. In this case, that it's harder if you're stupid sort of means to me not accepting the fact that it's going to be hard. Thinking that it's just going to be easy. Thinking that everything is just going to fall into place and the proverbial rose-colored glasses. I don't know that that's always the healthiest way to walk through life. So I think some sort of calibration about, you know, I mean, the quote from Princess Bride sums it up for me, right? Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says different is selling something. And it's the idea that, you know, the Greek-born Roman slave Epictetus, Stoic philosopher, said it's not the thing itself, it's the view we take of it which disturbs us. With that idea that anything that happens in nature is neither implicitly good nor bad. Things that happen willfully, I think we can say, have moral value, right? If I murder you, we can say that that has moral value and that that's a bad thing because I've denied you your ability to live your life in the way you want. If you get hit by a bus, that's unfortunate. It's upsetting, but it's not, there's no moral value to it. There's no ethical value to it. And I think that if we can begin to calibrate and ask questions about our neuroses, our fears, and also about what our desires and our outcomes and where we want to get to are, then we can start calibrating ourselves with the skills and the worldview to deal with the unknown and the unknowable and the day-to-day stressors and difficulties of life.
So comes down to needing a system, something you could say, not necessarily something as simple as a journal, if you will, something that you write in every day and you kind of, maybe you measure out those goals, but something that you have to back up and have something more tangible. A philosophy.
Yeah, I like the word ethos, because I think that that word gives us. It's not one that gets used in day-to-day conversation much, so it forces us to stop and reflect. I just saw a thing today on Twitter, and I'm printing it out and putting it up in my office, and I absolutely love it. And it's a letter from Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, to Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the head of the British fascist movement, particularly in the 30s, in the lead up to World War II. And Mosley had written to Russell about collaborating on something, and Russell's reply is this very matter-of-fact, our respective ethos are so divergent, and I not only disagree with you, but I find you morally repellent, that there is no way for us to collaborate on something. It would produce no value in my life, and therefore I'm not going to. But so that idea that, yeah, we need an ethos, we need a standard by which we measure ourselves. And, you know, throughout time, I mean, every culture has its ethos. Every group that you are a part of has its ethos, whether it's spoken or not, whether it's written or not. I'm a big believer they need to be written down. Much in the same way that goals that aren't written down are wishes, an ethos that is not written down is not a tool. It is not a unifying tool. It is something that is constantly open to misinterpretation. Reinterpretation is totally cool. I'm not much for dogma. I don't like dogmatic thinking. I like living systems that are open to change and adjusting to new evidence being introduced and new views being introduced. But I do think that an ethos needs to be written down. And I mean, we've done that with Adult Academy. We've published it on our webpage. You know, our mission is to make the world a better place. And then we establish the conditions by which we seek to do that. So,
well, I was going to say, you're going to have to hit them up, and again, you know, we've talked about them. Just going to identify them, talk about them. What are we going to do here?
Yeah. So for us, with the Adult Academy project, we have identified 6 values as essential to our ethos of making the world a better place, our mission of making the world a better place. And the values, the ethos that supports that are 6 broad values: empathy, agency, self-reliance, mutual aid, resilience, and kindness. And we talk about those 6 things with a little bit of an interchangeable order. Empathy is always first, kindness is always last. And that's because we believe that you need to start by trying to understand and appreciate the worldview of others and not simply coming from a closed-off place, and that you should end with trying to be kind to your fellow man. But I think that those values, empathy, agency, mutual aid, self-reliance, resilience, and kindness, cover this broad spectrum of being able to engage in the world in a useful, beneficial, helpful way where your goals and objectives matter, but so do the goals and objectives of others. And trying to address those things in a way where differences of opinion can be seen as that, where where inconsiderate or non-thoughtful worldviews can attempt to be addressed in a way that encourages people to be more reflective, critical thinking, and trying to look outside of the tight little bubble of primate fear that we live in, and the tight little bundle of neuroses that we're all fighting against in one way, shape, or form or another. The idea is to try and transcend those things as much as we can.
Seems like a good place to pick up for next week, doesn't it?
Let's do it. We want to extend a big thank you to singer-songwriter and all-around awesome dude Frank Turner for the use of his song Photosynthesis as our theme song. Please visit frank-turner.com to check out Frank and his work, and follow the links in the show notes to buy his songs on iTunes or on Amazon. If you purchase through Amazon, you also support this show.
And please subscribe to the podcast, sign up for our email list to get notifications of all our new content, and share what we're doing here with your friends. You can visit us at adultacademy.org to find all of our content. You can buy a shirt from our Teespring store and support us by using our Amazon link to buy your cat food. There's no more valuable resource any of us have than our time. Thanks for spending your time with us today. Cheers.